Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here, and I have just moved my green screen from one room to another so that my audience have one less annoying little pedantic thing to moan about. Yeah! Anyway, for those of you who are new to my channel, if there is anyone new to this channel, then you might want to know that I have procured quite a lot of games over the years. In fact, I own probably over 3,000 games around my house, and I started collecting, if you want to call it that, collecting games quite heavily around 2002. Basically, that's when I turned 16 and started going around the boot sales and buying up NES games, Master System games, Mega Drive games, Super Nintendo games, etc. The rule I set myself back then around these boot sales was that I would never pay more than £1 for a game. 50p most of the time in most cases. However, sometimes boot sale sellers would try and sell me Super Nintendo games for prices like £2, and I would literally laugh in their face like, I'm not paying £2 for a bloody old game. That would be stupid, wouldn't it? There's bloody loads of them. These games are everywhere. So why would I pay you £2 when I can just pay Discman over here £1 instead? So that's basically what I used to do. In fact, now I'm not one of the only people who collect these old games. There are now more people than ever who have gotten into this hobby. And now that leads me to the subject of today's video. And that is Super Nintendo game collecting, and essentially how collecting for that system has just got so bloody ridiculous. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Anyway, something what people always bring to the table when it comes to a video like this is, supply and demand. All of these subjects just come straight down to supply and demand. There's obviously a higher demand for customers who want Super Nintendo games than there is a supply out there. That's what you would suspect anyway. However, you could say that for pretty much most retro gaming systems at this point in time, couldn't you? So why the Super Nintendo exactly? What's so special about that system that's making people want to pay such ridiculous sums of money for the games? Especially when it was only a few years ago when collecting for that system was quite cheap. Like, for example, I suppose, getting into game collecting, the Super Nintendo was one of the first systems in which I started going for games on, because I grew up with the Super Nintendo, and more importantly, the games for the thing were bloody cheap. But at the same time I was going around these boot sales, I was collecting Mega Drive games in equal quantity. And to be fair, Mega Drive games, they're worth a lot more money than they was back then, obviously, but they're not even close in price to what people pay for Super Nintendo games on average. So what's that all about? You could say, it's nostalgia, isn't it? It's nostalgia. In a lot of places in the world, the Super Nintendo outsold the Mega Drive, so more people are going to be after Super Nintendo games because they've got memories to reflect back on. You could say that to some degree, but then you could say if there's less Mega Drive games, then they're rarer, so people would want to pay more for them. However, I can confirm in the United Kingdom, where the Super Nintendo was outsold by the Mega Drive, Super Nintendo games are more expensive. In the United States, where the Super Nintendo outsold the Genesis, Super Nintendo games are still more expensive. So you've got the same scenario in both regions, despite the Super Nintendo performing completely differently. Like, that's crazy, isn't it? So straight away, we can rule nostalgia out as one of the main reasons as to why that system specifically is so expensive. Now next, and this is a reason why I would not really want to jump into Super Nintendo Collect at this stage. There's so many ways that you can bloody play Super Nintendo games now. Like, the actual original Super Nintendo system, it's really obsolete in today's day and age, isn't it? Because it hasn't got a HDMI. Not that I'm saying CRTs aren't great, and it's not great to play an old Super Nintendo on a CRT, because I love doing that personally, but if I was just getting into it, I don't think I'd really want to start collecting for a system that's so ludicrously priced. So how come there's still so many people wanting to get into Super Nintendo collecting? And all I can infer, there's so many people trying to get into the Super Nintendo collecting because there's so many ways to play Super Nintendo games. So it must have hooked in loads of extra people who are interested in the Super Nintendo after the Super Nintendo's life cycle. Like, they must maybe grew up on, I don't know, the GameCube or the Wii U or the Wii or something, and they're just Nintendo fans who are younger who now want to go for a retro system, despite being able to play all the games anyway. Like, let's discuss all the different ways we could play Super Nintendo games if you've not got a Super Nintendo. The first one, from what I remember, you could just emulate them all for free on a PC very, very easily, and the experience isn't much different to the Super Nintendo. There's limited differences in emulating on the PC or playing on the original hardware. After that as well, 2006, we had the Nintendo Wii come out, didn't we? Firstly, you had the eShop on there, so suddenly all the games became available again, really cheap. I believe it was about £3.50 each at the time to download Super Nintendo games. Could be wrong, but I think that's how much it cost. So you could suddenly download and play the Super Nintendo games legally, but again, if you wanted to play them illegally, you could just hack your Wii really, really easily, and again, just download all the games off the internet, put them on an SD card, and then play every single Super Nintendo game on a Wii. So then that's suddenly 3 ways to play Super Nintendo games. And also around the same time, people started hacking original Xboxes, can load the Super Nintendo games onto them, done that as well. You can hack the PlayStation Portable, put all the games onto there so you can play most of the games in a portable experience. You've got the Android gaming tablets, Android mobile phones, you can play the Super Nintendo library on there. And then another official way to play the games comes out with the Super Nintendo Mini as well. So not only have you got 30 of the top titles, I think it's 30, it might be slightly less than that, all preloaded on the device to play, but once again the system is really, really easy to hack. So you can once again get the games off the internet, put them on the Super Nintendo Mini, and that's, apart from all that, you can also download games onto the Wii U legally, you can download SNES games onto the 3DS legally. There's just so many ways to play Super Nintendo games. So you would think with so many ridiculous amount of different ways to play, that would make Super Nintendo games practically worthless, because probably a toaster could emulate Super Nintendo games at this stage. A watch could emulate Super Nintendo games this day and age. Everything can play Super Nintendo games. So you would think with all that, the Super Nintendo games would be worthless, but no, it's had the complete opposite effect. Because so many people appear to have been exposed to these games in one shape, way or another, people now seem to want to pay out extortionate amounts for Super Nintendo games, kind of just for the prestige of having a trinket of owning an original cartridge and a cardboard box, because logically at this stage in time there's no reason to really want Super Nintendo games. There's so many ways to get them, as I said, so it's literally got to be about bragging rights. I genuinely can't think of any other reason why you would start Super Nintendo collecting this late into the game, after the prices of every game have spiked to ludicrous amounts. Like, even quite underwhelming titles like Super Mario Kart. Like, there's a ridiculous amount of other Mario Kart games which are cheaper and better, but you still have to pay a high premium if you want to play Super Mario Kart on its original cartridge. It's crazy. I suppose part of the reason for the games going up in value so much as well is the fact that Super Nintendo games had cardboard boxes, whereas Mega Drive games had the plastic boxes, and I think people would pay more for the cardboard boxes just because most people just chuck their cardboard boxes away, and that's had a ricochet effect on the cartridge only copies of the game. So as the price of the game with the cardboard box has gone up, the cartridge on its own has artificially raised in value simultaneously, because from what I've noticed over the years, you just pay literally double for a boxed copy that you would a loose copy. So the loose copies have gone up anyway. So that's my theory on that as well. And then there's all the obvious reasons as well, which we've gone over time and time again, why Super Nintendo games are worth ridiculous money. You've got all the YouTubers, haven't you? Like, you had a certain amount of American retro gaming YouTubers for a long time who didn't really cover anything on their channels but stuff like the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo. So that was pretty much the bulk of their content at a time when there wasn't a vast array of retro gaming content around. So I think the Nintendo's popularity in America in general, as I've stated on this channel many times before, has ricocheted across the planet and created a false nostalgia from the echo chamber, which we've talked about. I've talked about this lots. So I suppose the main thing from this video, smartphones as well. The rise of smartphones has allowed any idiot to check the artificial value of each product. So the more people look at their smartphone and say, oh, this game is worth X amount, so it's got to be worth that. Other people would then buy the game if it's at that price. So there's lots of things that have contributed to the artificial inflation of Super Nintendo games. But yes, I think the main overriding contributing factor which has pushed Super Nintendo games' value above most other consoles is the fact that there's just so many ways to play Super Nintendo today. And people have just got into a strange culture of wanting the game for the sake of owning the cartridge as kind of a bragging right, rather than wanting to actually play it. That's all I can infer from all of this, because, like I said, for most other systems, they haven't been affected anywhere near as drastically as the Super Nintendo. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me know in the comment section why Super Nintendo games specifically seem to be a lot more valuable than the average game on the majority of other platforms. I know there's others like the Neo Geo, for example, where games were a fortune, but that would make sense because the games were a fortune when they were released, and obviously not many people would have bought them because they were so expensive. So it makes sense for the Neo Geo games to be worth a fortune, but the Super Nintendo, a platform what was as common as muck, where all the games were mass produced and as common as muck, so these common as muck games are worth loads? It's crazy, isn't it? So let's discuss this and try and get to the bottom of it. Let's have a nice big mass debate in my comment section. Yeah. Cheerio!
Born in London in '86, a stachio gent named Richard Parliament. He loves to wrestle, but he loves one more thing: handhelds round the world. He fights in his comments and he argues with fans. It's a problem no one understands. If there's two things he loves, it's gaming and handhelds round the world. Drinking fine wine, fighting fanboys, handhelds round the world.
Top Hat Gaming Man.